For 3 decades, Johnny Carson reigned as the king of late night. With his quick wit and warm smile, he turned The Tonight Show into America's nightly ritual. But behind the curtain, Carson's smile sometimes faded. According to producers and friends, he kept a mental list of stars he privately despised, legends whose charm on camera masked something far darker once the red light went off. These weren't just difficult guests. Carson described some as bullies, manipulators, and even truly hateful human beings. From Hollywood queens with ice in their veins to comedians who mocked his staff, Carson saw through the illusion of stardom like few ever could. And before we begin, if you admired Johnny Carson's honesty and no-nonsense instincts, leave a like as a tribute to his legacy and share your favorite Carson memory in the comments. Now let's count down the 9 Golden Age guests Johnny Carson revealed were secretly evil. When Joan Crawford appeared on The Tonight Show in 1962, she did so with the regal poise of a Hollywood queen. In fact, she had the distinction of being Johnny Carson's very first guest on his debut night as host. To millions of viewers, Crawford embodied timeless elegance, impeccable posture, perfect diction, and a presence that commanded attention. But behind the camera, staff members claimed her charm was nothing more than a mask. Before taping, she reportedly issued a 4-page list of demands covering everything from lighting angles to the exact studio temperature, 67 degrees, not a degree more or less. On set, she was gracious to Carson himself, but allegedly ruthless toward anyone she deemed beneath her. One infamous incident saw her berating a 20-year-old assistant so viciously that staff had to intervene. Carson later confided that interviewing Crawford was like talking to a beautiful statue with nothing inside. Years later, when her daughter Christina released Mommy Dearest, a memoir filled with shocking allegations of abuse, Carson wasn't surprised. According to close friends, he quietly nodded and said, "I saw who she really was." Crawford's icy reserve chilled Carson, but his next nightmare guest was fire itself, an unpredictable powder keg who turned live television into a battleground. If Joan Crawford froze Carson with icy reserve, Shelley Winters brought the opposite energy, explosive, unpredictable, and impossible to contain. Winters was a 2-time Oscar winner, but on Carson's couch she was less a guest and more a storm. She rarely played by the rules of late night. Instead of lighthearted anecdotes, she would veer into fiery monologues about politics or social issues, leaving Carson struggling to steer the conversation back to safe ground. Her volatility wasn't just verbal. During one infamous appearance with actor Oliver Reed, Winters snapped after enduring his drunken sexist remarks. In front of a stunned audience, she hurled her drink straight into his face, a moment that lived on in late-night legend. Crew members even admitted they sometimes removed glasses and bottles from the set when Winters was booked, fearing she'd find new projectiles. Carson, known for his ability to stay calm with any guest, once remarked privately that interviewing Winters was like trying to steer a tornado. Her appearances were magnetic but exhausting, leaving everyone on edge about what might happen next. While Winters' fire made Carson nervous, his next guest posed a different kind of challenge. This one wasn't fueled by passion, it was fueled by an ego so enormous that it swallowed entire shows whole. To the audience at home, Orson Welles was the genius behind Citizen Kane, a booming voice, a larger-than-life storyteller, and one of the greatest directors in film history. But to Johnny Carson and his staff, Welles was a nightmare guest who acted as though The Tonight Show was his personal stage. From the moment he arrived, the problems began. Writers recalled how Welles would dismiss every single prepared question as pedestrian, handing back blank pages for Carson to improvise. Once on the couch, he treated time limits as optional. A 7-minute segment could balloon into 25, as Welles launched into meandering tales about theater, Rome, or his own brilliance. Stories that left producers scrambling and bumped other guests completely off the lineup. Even worse was his arrogance towards staff. He allegedly refused to address assistants directly, instead barking commands like, "Tell the girl I need more water," while she stood right in front of him. On one occasion, he even tried to direct the studio cameras himself, standing up mid-show to instruct operators on their angles. Carson, who prized precision and professionalism, was infuriated. After one particularly disastrous taping, he vented to Ed McMahon, "Genius doesn't excuse everything. Being brilliant doesn't give you the right to hijack someone else's show." If Welles embodied unchecked ego, Carson's next adversary was something darker, a charming crooner whose power and connections made even Johnny uneasy. On screen, Frank Sinatra brought effortless charm. He'd croon a song, trade jokes with Carson, and leave audiences swooning. But off camera, Carson reportedly saw another side of Old Blue Eyes, a side that made him one of the most feared and disliked guests in Tonight Show history. Sinatra never came alone. He arrived with an entourage of tough-looking men who prowled the studio like bodyguards, creating an atmosphere staff described as being under surveillance. Carson respected Sinatra's talent, but resented the way he wielded his power. Crew members remembered moments where Sinatra would physically intimidate staff, grabbing a floor manager by the tie after being given a time cue, hissing, "I'll go on when I'm ready." The man, a veteran in his 50s, was shaken for days. Carson also bristled at Sinatra's arrogance. He canceled appearances last minute, sometimes while already in the building. During one taping, Sinatra made a crude remark about a female staffer during a commercial break. Carson broke his usual cool detachment and snapped, "We don't talk about my staff that way here." The tension was palpable, and though the cameras captured smiles, everyone in the room knew the hostility was real. Carson later told a producer, if he didn't sing, he'd be a mob enforcer. Maybe he was both. Sinatra's bullying rattled Carson, but the next guest on his blacklist was far worse. According to Johnny, this one wasn't just difficult, he was truly hateful. Jerry Lewis was a legend, an innovator in comedy, a successful filmmaker, and a household name thanks to his iconic telethons. To the public, he was a tireless entertainer who dedicated himself to children's causes. But Johnny Carson, who had seen behind the curtain, reportedly called Lewis something far different, truly hateful. Lewis's behavior on The Tonight Show was infamous among staff. Instead of respecting Carson's role as host, he constantly hijacked the spotlight. He would interrupt other guests, talk over Johnny, and even once reached across the desk to adjust Carson's tie without permission, a deliberate power move that enraged the famously reserved host. Carson hated being touched unless he initiated it, and Lewis knew it. His treatment of staff was worse. He refused to learn names, referring to people as camera guy or makeup girl, regardless of their seniority. In one shocking incident, Lewis exploded at a cameraman for coughing during rehearsal, screaming that he breathed like an amateur and demanding he be removed from the studio. Witnesses said Carson never forgot it. What disturbed Carson most was the hypocrisy. He saw Lewis cry on telethons about his love for children, then belittle and humiliate working-class crew members hours later. After Lewis's final appearance in the early 80s, Johnny privately vowed, "Never again." If Lewis disgusted Carson with cruelty disguised as comedy, the next guest left him unsettled for a different reason: flamboyant charm masking troubling prejudice. Jane Russell was one of Hollywood's most glamorous stars, a sultry screen siren from films like Gentlemen Prefer Blondes and The Outlaw. On Carson's couch, she appeared charming and self-assured, sharing witty stories from the Golden Age. But behind the scenes, Carson reportedly found her intolerable, not for diva behavior, but for the views she expressed when the cameras weren't rolling. Russell's conservative politics often spilled into her Tonight Show visits, but Carson could tolerate differences in opinion. What he couldn't stand were her personal attacks on staff and other guests. According to multiple accounts, she once refused to let a gay makeup artist work on her, demanding a replacement. Even more troubling was her alleged refusal to appear on the same episode as Rock Hudson, making derogatory remarks about his sexuality at a time when it wasn't yet public knowledge but widely known in Hollywood circles. Carson, who had close friends and colleagues in the gay community, was reportedly furious. He prided himself on treating his crew with respect and protecting them from humiliation. Russel's comments clashed with his values, and after a particularly uncomfortable appearance in 1973, where she dismissed civil rights legislation during a commercial break, Carson quietly told producers not to bring her back. For a man who rarely banned guests, it was a decisive move. To Johnny, Russel's beauty and fame couldn't mask what he considered blatant cruelty. But if Russel's prejudice disgusted him, his next guest drove him mad in a very different way, with chaos, whiskey, and a tongue sharp enough to cut through steel. Bette Davis was a legend long before she ever sat on Carson's couch, an icon with 2 Oscars, a razor-sharp wit, and a presence that filled any room. On The Tonight Show, she dazzled audiences with stories of old Hollywood, her gravelly voice and cutting humor making for great television. But off-camera, staff recalled a very different experience, one of intimidation, cruelty, and verbal assaults that even Johnny struggled to stomach. Davis had a habit of dominating the set. If booked alongside younger actresses, she would reportedly talk over them, physically turning her back on other guests so the camera stayed fixed on her. Crew members remembered her snapping at assistants and cue card holders, once reducing a young staffer to tears during rehearsal. Carson, usually reluctant to confront guests, quietly stepped in, warning her, "On this show, we speak to everyone with respect, or we don't speak at all." Her reputation for drinking before tapings didn't help. Whiskey in the dressing room often fueled her temper, leading to cutting remarks about colleagues, crew, and even other guests. One producer described her appearances as less an interview, more a courtroom cross-examination. Carson admired Davis's talent, but after her final appearance, he reportedly told his team, "That's enough. Life's too short to be flogged on air by Bette Davis." And if Davis's verbal lashings left scars, Carson's next difficult guest made him squirm for an even more troubling reason, an aging child star whose behavior toward women crossed dangerous lines. Mickey Rooney was once Hollywood royalty, the #1 box office draw in the world during the late 1930s. By the time he appeared on The Tonight Show in the 1970s, his career had shifted into nostalgia territory. To viewers, he was the beloved star of Babes in Arms and Judy Garland musicals. But Carson and his staff reportedly dreaded his visits, not because of fading stardom, but because of his behavior. According to multiple staff accounts, Rooney was notorious for crossing personal boundaries, especially with young female assistants. He allegedly made suggestive comments, held their hands too long, and pulled them close under the guise of friendliness. He thinks being short gives him license to be a pervert, Carson reportedly snapped to a producer after one particularly troubling taping. Some assistants even asked to be reassigned when Rooney was booked. Alcohol often made matters worse. Several crew members recalled Rooney stumbling through interviews, slurring his words, or veering into wildly inappropriate anecdotes. During one infamous segment, he began telling a story about Judy Garland that grew so unsettling, Carson abruptly cut him off and pivoted to another topic. Afterward, Johnny privately apologized to a young actress on set for Rooney's behavior, something crew said was almost unheard of for the usually guarded host. For Carson, Rooney embodied the darker side of Hollywood nostalgia, a once great star who couldn't adapt to changing times. And yet, even Rooney's chaos couldn't compare to Carson's final entry, a diva so demanding she nearly drove him to despair. Zsa Zsa Gabor was everything late-night audiences loved, glamorous, witty, and endlessly quotable. She leaned into her Hungarian accent, her many marriages, and her extravagant lifestyle, making her a Tonight Show regular. But for Carson and his staff, her charm ended the moment the cameras stopped rolling. Behind the scenes, Gabor's behavior became the stuff of legend. Her list of demands rivaled any rock star. Producers recalled she insisted on a 74-degree dressing room, orchids only, never carnations, Perrier water chilled with exactly 3 ice cubes, and even her own lighting technician flown in at the show's expense. She also allegedly forbade female guests under 40 from appearing on the same episode. If any of these conditions weren't met, she would refuse to leave her dressing room, delaying taping for hours. One infamous incident saw her erupt over the makeup department not having her preferred brand of foundation. She screamed until Carson himself had to intervene, calming her down enough to get her on stage. "I'd rather interview a cat," Johnny later joked privately. At least the cat wouldn't need 3 assistants and a lighting crew. What frustrated Carson most wasn't just the chaos she created, but the way it disrupted everyone else, from guests stuck waiting to crew forced into overtime. Still, she kept returning because despite the headaches, Zsa Zsa always delivered on camera. For Johnny Carson, however, she represented everything he despised: entitlement, excess, and fame used as a weapon. Johnny Carson's blacklist wasn't written down, but those who worked closest to him knew exactly which names were on it: Joan Crawford, Shelley Winters, Orson Welles, Frank Sinatra, Jerry Lewis, Jane Russell, Bette Davis, Mickey Rooney, and Zsa Zsa Gabor. To America, they were legends, faces of Hollywood's golden age, larger-than-life personalities who seemed untouchable. But to Carson, they were something else entirely. Examples of how fame could corrupt, intimidate, and even humiliate the people around them. What made Carson's judgment so unique was that he never sought to expose these stories publicly. He didn't go to tabloids or use his platform to humiliate his guests. Instead, he quietly noted who they really were when the cameras weren't rolling. He measured their character not by how they treated him, but by how they treated the assistants, the cameramen, the makeup artists, the people without power. And when someone failed that test, Carson never forgot. Decades later, his private opinions still peel back the glossy veneer of Hollywood's golden age, reminding us that even the brightest stars often cast the darkest shadows. So what do you think? Was Johnny Carson right to quietly blacklist these stars, or should he have exposed them publicly at the time? Drop a comment below with your thoughts, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more forgotten Hollywood tales.